You're listening to B2B Tech Talk with Ingram Micro, where we share topics that will inspire business growth and help you stay ahead of advances in technology before they become mainstream. This episode is sponsored by Ingram Micro Xvantage, the game-changing platform that will transform your business potential and reshape how customers see you. On today's episode of B2B Tech Talk, we have Bob Slinzak with us. He is Director of Information Security at Ingram Micro. Bob previously worked as Special Agent for the U.S. Secret Service, where he specialized in cybercrime and digital forensics. He also worked in the automotive sector as a cyber incident responder and manager of incident response, vulnerability management, and penetration testing. Welcome to the show, Bob.
Thank you.
It's good to have you here today. So, we're going to be talking about a bunch of things regarding security, but first, I have to ask this. Ingram Micro has hired a lot of former Secret Service employees. Other than protecting elected officials, because that's how I think of Secret Service, walking around with the president or his kids or, whatever, what else are they responsible for?
Sure, that's a great question. We get that a lot. The Secret Service is unique in its law enforcement mission. It has actually two missions. The first, as you mentioned, is protection of the executive leadership of the United States and a lengthy list of other people, like, as you mentioned, family members and even visiting foreign dignitaries. So we do a lot of protection at the Secret Service, of course. But the other mission that we have is protecting the financial infrastructure of the United States. So helping to ensure that the banking infrastructure is working the way it should. The suppression of counterfeit currency is a big part of what the Secret Service does. And historically speaking, the Secret Service, one of the Secret Service's original missions was the suppression of counterfeit currency. So supporting that financial infrastructure is very important and really, a core part of their mission and identity in the law enforcement world.
That's fascinating. I never knew that. And I bet you there's a lot of people out there that didn't know that either. So I'm sure companies like Ingram Micro face and respond to cyber threats every day, probably every minute of every day. As a team, as a security team, which I know Ingram Micro has a large security team, how do you prioritize which ones to respond to?
That's a great question, Nina, because we literally get thousands of events that are interesting from a security perspective every day. So what we do is we look at those events on a risk basis. What potentially could be impacted? How significant would that impact be if this is something that takes off, like ransomware in our environment? And we prioritize based on what we see from our tools, our experience in handling these kinds of things. But really, it just comes down to how much risk is posed by this. Some things are easy for us to deal with. Other things take a lot of effort. But it really just comes down to how much risk the event exerts in our environment.
I would imagine, of course, I'm trying to visualize how that would work out if everybody just gets in a room and says, "Hey, what do you got? What do you got? What's your risk level?" I find, again, all of this so fascinating. How much time is spent looking at potential threats versus looking at threats that exist in the moment?
Sure. So we spend a lot of time. We have a 24-hour, 7-day a week, 365-day team that monitors security events for our global network. And they spend us, that's all they spend their time on. And that's the Security Operations Center that does that. When things get to a point where we feel they need deeper investigation and potential incident response, they move over to our security incident response team, which is also 24 hours a day. We cover Ingram's global footprint with a global team that's available all the time.
Wow, I feel like we need something like that at home. And speaking of home, everybody probably has a computer full of applications that they use. And now all the applications, it feels like you're having to give a lock of hair, put your finger up here, do the hokey pokey, whatever it is. But multi-factor authentication is obviously, it's been around for a while, but it seems to be across the board. How really effective is it?
That's a great question. Multi-factor authentication is really a great tool. It helps significantly improve the security of access to applications and systems. However, it's not flawless. There are successful attacks against MFA, and the most common one is called the MFA fatigue attack. And what happens there is your little MFA application continues to get requests from the hacker to allow access to something. But it's not your activity that's causing those. Unfortunately, when somebody gets 3 or 4 or 5 of those, they stop looking and validating really what's going on in their MFA application, and they just start clicking yes to allow the access. And what happens then is the attacker then gets into the system and takes advantage of that. So MFA is really good. We encourage it. I encourage people to use it in their daily lives with their home, systems, banking systems they need to get into. But it's really important in our corporate environment. But it's like every other security tool. It's not perfect. It's not flawless. There are ways around it. So we have to be vigilant for that.
Now, you have a web presentation coming out soon on cyber fraud, which I know I'm going to be watching. Can you give us a preview of what we can expect from that?
Yeah, I'd love to. We worked really hard on these presentations. I'm not the only person giving a presentation, but mine is on cyber fraud or cyber crime and how it impacts us at Ingram Micro. We'll talk about what cyber fraud really is, and I'll talk people through a real life case that I worked a long time ago with a real life hacker. And we'll talk about some ways to keep safe, some strategies to avoid being the victim of cyber fraud as well.
Excellent. I am so looking forward to that. Bob Slinzak, thank you so much for your time. I appreciate you joining us on the show today.
Thanks for having me, Nina. Appreciate it.
You've been listening to Ingram Micro's B2B Tech Talk. Thanks for tuning in. If you like this episode and you want to continue the conversation online, use hashtag B2B Tech Talk.